I want to welcome everybody to the meeting. This is a public comment meeting for the Denver Building and Fire Code proposed amendments. My name is Scott Prisco. I'm the building official for the City and County of Denver. Just for housekeeping purposes, because the format that we have, we wanted to keep it more interactive so that people can talk and communicate throughout our process. If I could ask everyone to mute their phones and mute their computers so that while we're presenting certain aspects that we don't get the feedback and whatnot, I think it'd be a more productive meeting. And then Amanda Weston will be facilitating the meeting in a few minutes. She'll give you all the nuance of how we're going to proceed with the meeting. The first thing I'd like to do is just say thank you very much for all the folks that were involved in our original code adoption for our amendments, the 2019 Denver Building and Fire Code amendments. I want to thank everyone. I know a lot of folks on this call were participatory in those committees, whether you had proposals or whether you were actually on a committee. I just want to thank you for your interest and continued interest in being here in this meeting. This is really important to us, and we want to make sure we get this right. The intent of this amendment that we're going through now, we realize there are various errata in the proposed amendments that we had, mostly typos, content error, relationship of code section, numerical errors, and just some content that needs to be reworked because it's in conflict to what was discussed at the meetings. So I want to be very clear that this is really primarily errata, and we will have another code cycle coming up next year. Most likely that will start in the spring. There'll be some pre-meetings, we think, surrounding the green building code where goals and vision are for that, and for the IECC we'll have some goals and vision strategies on where we're heading as a city and amendments that may want to be proposed for those two codes. So there'll be sort of a precursor opportunity for involvement, and then our actual formal process will start in the spring, early summer of next year. We're hopeful to run it the same way that we did last time, so that each committee will be outlining their specific, so fire will have their committees, and the IEBC and IEBC will be on a committee. IECC will have a separate committee. IRC will have a separate committee. We felt it ran very smoothly that way, and we had very focused, targeted groups of folks in each one of the committees, and so that you weren't having to listen to maybe erroneous information from different committees, and you really just were focused on one. We think it worked really well last time. We had some positive feedback on that process, and we'd like to continue the same way. If you have an interest in that and you want to follow that program, you can sign up for our newsletter for denvergov.org/DS, and we have a newsletter that will keep you in the loop of that process. If you have an interest in being on a code committee again, or for the first time, you're welcome to email Amanda Weston to express an interest in a committee, a specific committee for the code. So again, thank you all for being here. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Amanda. And again, I would ask everybody to mute their phones if they're not talking. There will be opportunity for interactive process for this meeting. We do want to get feedback for where we're headed with this. It's all yours, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So here's how our meeting is going to go today. As Scott mentioned, everyone will stay on mute. And we will use, what will happen is I will read through all of the proposed changes on each slide. And at the end of reading through those proposed changes, we'll open it up for any sort of discussion that this group wants to have. If you can please use the raise your hand function in Teams to get in a queue for asking questions or providing comments on the proposed changes. I will call on everybody individually using that raise your hand function. So when you're called on, you can unmute your microphone. One thing to note is that if you've dialed into this meeting using your phone and not through the Teams app, if you've used the phone number, remember to push *6 to mute and unmute yourself. So with that, we'll get going with our agenda for today. So first, we're going to go through the admin section of the Denver Building Code. Then we'll go through the International Fire Code, then the International Building Code and International Existing Building Code, the International Mechanical Code, the International Residential Code, the International Energy Conservation Code, and then we'll jump back to the IRC just for a moment, because what we've done is we've placed all of the EV charger amendments at the end of the IEC section, and then we've also put the ones related to the IRC directly following that, so that they're all together and that conversation can kind of stay together. And then finally, we'll move on to the proposed amendments for the Denver Green Code. So for our admin section, one of the proposed changes that we have made is simply changing the Department of Public Works to the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, DOTI. That is the new name for Public Works. Admin section 101.1, we've added clarifications provided for effective dates and applicable code addition. Admin 131.8, we've revised to allow electronic signatures, and we've changed the term certified to licensed for the access control supervisor. Admin 133.2.10, we've added required information for electrical drawings per the 2020 NEC and 2019 Denver Building Code. And 133.2.7.c, we've added the requirement to provide the list of the codes used in the project's design in the code analysis. Does anybody have any questions or comments related to any of these proposed amendments? If you could raise your hand at this point, I will call on you. I don't see any hands raised, so I'll go ahead and move to the next slide. We're going to start, these are all of the proposed amendments for the IFC. We've got multiple slides within the IFC. So for Chapter 5, we've corrected punctuation. 605.8 and 806.5, we've corrected section references. 5003, clarified language. 909.15.3.3, 1 and 2. There were some code changes. 2306.7.3, clarified language. 2309.5.3, some edits have been made. 2311.4.5, corrected section references. 2311.8.9, reverted to base code. 2311.4.6, edited. 2311.8.9.1, corrected section references. 2312.1, edits. I know that these aren't as descriptive as some of the other summarization. So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand at this time. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. 916.3, clarified language. 1107, corrected section references. 2307.3 and 5307.3 and 5307.6, edits. 606.2, 606.8.3, 606.10, 606.11, and 5701.2 corrected section references. 2001.1 corrected spelling errors. 903.3.9, 907.3.3, and in 103.1, number 5, corrected section references. And same with 1103.2, 3903.1.3, 3903.2, 3904.1, 3211, and 3206. And lastly, 909.15.3, clarified language. And I do see that, Brad, you have your hand up. If you'd like to unmute, you can ask your question.
Hi, Amanda. Just real quick, would it be possible to display the table of amendment change or RADA on the screen?
What do you mean by that?
Well, just that you're going down the list. I know that there's a posted table on the internet. I could share my screen if you want. That I pulled down. It's got all of the errata listed. I'm just thinking it might be helpful for people for a visual.
Brad, I think we'll do that when there's a question, possibly, if that might be useful when there's. But if there aren't questions on these items, then because the meeting will take way more than I think the 2 hours allotted if we go into that level of detail. And I think because most of these are non-controversial, and there are some that I think are going to have some more robust dialogue, that I maybe make more sense when there's an issue or a question. If someone wants further information, then we can do that.
That sounds great. Thank you, Scott. If anybody has any questions on these, you can raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next slide. Okay. We've got N103.2 and N103.4. We've edited to allow more projects to be processed as walkthrough permits for sprinkler and fire alarm work. 907.2.3, exception number 4, removed section to coordinate with the IBC and deleted exception that was already covered in exception number 3. 907.1.6 exempts Denver Fire Department radio boxes from transmitting contact or point ID because such hardware has been in service for many years and does not have such capability. 905.2.1 updated max design pressure for standpipe systems at 350 psi. Does anybody have any questions on or comments on these amendments? Right. We've got 114.2.18, which allows building engineers trained by the servicing contractor to conduct weekly or monthly churn tests on fire pumps without being DFD licensed. 317.3.1 keeps combustible vegetation, growing media, and mulch from immediately exposing building openings by requiring a 5 inch separation or protecting the opening with sprinklers. And 319.4.1.1 allows agent shutoff valve in food truck extinguishing systems to prevent accidental activation while the vehicle is being operated. Any questions or comments on these amendments? And lastly, we have section 503.2.1, which allows new bike lane elements in the required fire lane width to accommodate the city's new initiative. And 904.13, item number 4, coordinates the fire code with the mechanical code provisions by allowing a UL 300A hood suppression system in some Group B and R occupancy applications. Does anybody have any questions on the proposed IFC amendments? Okay, I will move on to the next set. Now we're moving into the IBC and IEBC. We've got section 310.4, which clarified applicability of codes and language consistency. 403.5.7 and 3007.6.4, italicized terms and updated language where previously inaccurate or missing. 1105.1 added clarifying language to help define applicability scope. And 3007.6.4 clarified that fire service access elevator lobby 8-foot minimum may include wheelchair spaces. Any questions or comments? Got Appendix S, section 4.1.5.3, clarified cross-reference and note installations in accordance with manufacturer's listing. 1010.1.9.13.7 deleted specific 45-minute requirement for opening protection at areas of refuge and replaced it with general reference to table 716.12 requirements for smoke barrier opening protection. And section 1011, which allowed the use of lithium powered batteries in lieu of building power for smoke alarms in one family dwellings being converted to a congregate residence for less than 10 occupants. Any questions or comments? And now we've got the IMC, the one and only proposed change, which is 401.2, corrected a disconnect created with the IECC amendments and clarified ventilation requirements in Denver. Any questions or comments? In our IRC section, we have table R301.21, corrected the winter design temperature to Fahrenheit and relocated the title of the table. Appendix Chapter E, corrected cross-reference to the IBC, correct section within the IBC. Status of appendices on adoption and Appendix V, we removed Appendix T and changed Appendix V to Appendix U to go in alphabetical order. We updated the year of reference pool and SPA code in Appendix Chapter V. R202, italicized terms. Table in 1106.4, revised ERI rating index requirement to 56 to match the IECC amendment. And in 1101.6, in 1101.11, in 1101.13, in 1102.1, in 1104.2, and IRC appendices, those will be discussed at the right after the IECC amendments, as these are related to the EV charger amendments. Oh, I'm sorry. Did anybody have any questions on any of these proposed amendments? Okay. Now we'll move on to the IECC. C401.2, we extended the application of the commercial provisions of the IECC to Group R2 occupancy, low-rise buildings. C402.5.1.2, clarified language. C406.3, clarified language to match the COM check. C403.8.6, revised numbering. C405.1.1, clarified language. Any questions or comments? R403.3.3 revised formatting to indicate the exceptions apply to entire section and added missing decimal point. R403.3.4 added missing decimal point. R402.4.1.2 corrected language. Appendix RA corrected numbering. C408.3.2.3 added the preliminary commissioning report for the electrical function testing. Table C402.4 revised location of the footnote references. Table C403.7.41 and 2 corrected the conversion rate. Any questions or comments? C408.2.4 added language to require the preliminary commission's report to be submitted to the project inspector. Figure C408.2.4 added section numbers for electrical preliminary commission's report. C401.2 modified various requirements to include EV chargers for all paths and modified the additional efficiency requirements to match the IECC. R404.2 added language to make EV chargers mandatory. C505.1 added language and exceptions from base code that were mistakenly removed. And I see Tyler Carlson has his hand up if you would like to ask your question or your comment.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay, Amanda?
Yes, I sure can.
Is now the time to provide comments on the EV charger language generally, or 'cause I don't recall exactly which sections my comments pertain to. I know there was a number of different sections it touched.
So the next slide has additional information.
Okay.
EV chargers. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, probably the next slide. Yeah, I'll wait till the next slide then.
Okay, great. I will come to you as soon as I get done reading this one. C402.5.1.2.3 added requirements of verification report and preliminary commissioning report. C406.1.1 added requirements of 2 additional efficiency package options and clarified language. C502.1 added requirement of 2 additional efficiency package options and clarified language. C202 and R202 modified definitions for EV chargers, and C405.10 and R404 modified requirements for EV chargers.
And Amanda, maybe just a point of clarification as we get questions on different topics. If the person speaking can state your name clearly, and then where you're employed, so we understand the reference of the comments. So it was just and a little any clarifying information that might be pertinent to your background. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Tyler, you're up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amanda. So once again, this is Tyler Carlson. I'm the managing partner at Evergreen Development. We're a retail and multifamily owner, operator, developer here in the city of Denver. I'm also a resident, and in addition to that, I am the government relations chair for the International Council of Shopping Centers, and I sit on the NAOP board. So I already submitted my commentary in writing on your website, but just to reiterate it here, had 3 suggestions for the EV charging section. The first suggestion is coming from dialogue that we've actually had with staff over the, this last many months about EV charging and its implication for some of our upcoming projects. And the first was that the potential exchange of the superchargers for the slower charger. At one point, there was a 5-for-1 conversion that was suggested by a landlord or property owner, spending the additional money to buy one of the fast chargers would get credit for up to 5 of the slower chargers, which are much less expensive. And somehow that got lost through the code revision process, and it's our strong recommendation that be put back in there. I think it's good policy to encourage property owners to invest in the latest and greatest technology, and especially those technologies that consumers are going to actually use. And for us, especially in the shopping center world, most customers who are using EV charging in a shopping center context have, relatively short trips. And for them to get much use out of a EV charger, it needs to be one of the superchargers that can charge a car in 20 to 30 minutes, not hours like the slow chargers do. So that's something that's really important to us and we think should go in there, and also will help mitigate the impact of just the raw number of chargers that are required by this code update. And along that same line of thinking, the other issue that's come up that has changed during this code update process is that initially the calculation for the charger requirement was going to be based upon the number of code required stalls. In this last draft, that went away and went to the actual provided number of stalls. And that's a huge issue in the retail restaurant world, especially because depending upon the tenant, they may exceed code by a significant number, and that would drive a enormous EV charging requirement that frankly outstrips any anticipated demand from any of the EV charging operators we're talking about. We have a grocery anchored project we're working out in Green Valley Ranch, and if we were to provide EV charging based upon the number of provided stalls, it would be off the charts and frankly an uneconomic option for us. So we'd want to encourage staff to go back to the requirement to be based upon those that are the code required number of stalls, not the provided. And if there's a situation like there are in some places in Denver where there is no parking requirement, then maybe for those zone districts you can base it upon what's provided. But in most zone districts in Denver, there is a parking requirement, and that's what the EV charging should be based upon. And then the third was about the requirement for EV chargers to be provided basically alongside ADA stalls, which may work in certain contexts, but in a shopping center context where you have multiple ADA requirements for multiple users, that would preclude the ability to aggregate charging stations within a shopping center, because there's ADA requirements everywhere. And the feedback that we've received from the actual companies who will install these is that they cannot do onesie, twosie chargers hither and thither around a whole shopping center. That doesn't work for their model, and the raw cost of routing all that all over a shopping center is cost prohibitive. And that in a retail center, what makes the most sense is for there to be an aggregation of EV charging stalls in one or two kind of centralized locations. That's what makes sense right now with the costs that you're burdening the private development sector with. So again, we're supportive of the green goals of the city of Denver. I don't think any of us have an issue with EV charging provision, but we need some accommodations on some of these details so that we can actually implement this in a way that is good public policy and also is economic for the development community. And with that, I will shut up.
Thank you, Tyler. I'm hoping maybe Keith Fox is on this call and can help answer any of the questions or comments that Tyler provided.
So, yeah, Amanda, we didn't talk about that. The specificity of this part of the meeting about the responses, and I agree, Keith would be the appropriate one to answer, at least begin that, and I'll chime in afterwards. And as I was sitting here, I'm wondering if we want to follow more of the code process format where the folks that have comments, that similar comments, not in favor of the proposed changes, that they all speak first, and then we could have our team as the proponents of the changes, since they were city and county driven, that we let the folks that are not in favor speak first.
Okay, we can certainly do that. Karen Levitt Ortiz, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you so much, Amanda. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So I also work for Evergreen Development alongside Tyler Carlson, and have been involved in some of the dialogue with the city, Keith Fox and Carol Pafford with the building department, kind of helping us navigate some of these new electric vehicle requirements that again, as Tyler mentioned, we're all proponents of making a more green initiative, but trying to better understand how it impacts our shopping centers and retail developments. So I won't go through, and rehash everything that Tyler mentioned, but just want to state the same concerns that we have as far as how the practicality of some of these code requirements will impact our developments and be very cost prohibitive, especially with the number of required spaces based on the provided stalls versus the required number of stalls, and then also the location of where those stalls are able to be accommodated on the shopping center or on the property in order to meet those ADA spacing requirements at each and every building. That's going to be difficult to, as Tyler mentioned, provide infrastructure and equipment throughout an entire shopping center rather than in one more centrally located area. And then lastly, again, as Tyler had mentioned, that fast charging replacement ratio seems to make a lot of sense for especially the retail world, where customers can better utilize a fast charger, and having that 5-to-1 sort of replacement ratio kind of helps us meet those requirements a little bit easier.
Okay, yes, my name is Keith Fox. I'm the lead engineer for the City and County of Denver for the IECC, and I'm also a mechanical engineer. But I've been working with the EV requirements, and to answer your three questions, the first one, the fast charger, we have added that back in to the amendments, so it is included. You are allowed to replace up to 5 of the level 2 chargers, provided that you provide 1 level 3 fast charger and 1 EV ready space for the facility. But you can only replace up to 5. We are not allowing you to replace all of them with level 3. It's only 1 group of 5 with 1 charger. The second question.
Why is that, Keith? Keith, why is that?
That's the way the proponent had proposed it, and that's why we carried it forward.
Who's the proponent?
Mike Salisbury.
Who's Mike Salisbury?
He's actually with the city and county of Denver with the CASR group. It's a Climate Action and Resiliency Sustainability team.
Okay, so we get to let one person decide the fate of the entire city of Denver? That
No.
doesn't seem democratic.
No, that's the way it was proposed to the IECC committee, and it was voted on and approved by the IECC committee with that language. The committee was made up of both city and public members.
And more public than city and county employees, just for clarification. And it was a very interactive process. I don't know, Tyler, if you were part of that process or not.
No, we didn't catch wind. The development community didn't catch wind of this until a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sure you guys did the outreach that you thought you needed to at the time. But I will tell you, as the as the board member of NAIOP and the government relations chair for ICSC, the two of the largest trade associations for commercial real estate in the city, we had zero awareness of this, zero.
Yeah,
So to not engage our trade associations in something as material as this is really a shame.
But again, your NIOP was well informed of our code adoption process, so I think that's unfair to categorize it that we were not inclusive of NIOP when they were definitely aware of our code adoption process.
Well, because the problem is that you've been under the cover of a code adoption process, been making major policy changes about EV chargers. When people assume code adoption, they're assuming tweaks to fire sprinkler specs and outlet locations, not policy changes associated that are huge cost impacts and impact site planning and major issues like this.
All right, I'm going to loop in at the end. I'll have a general conversation after Keith goes through some of these more specific topics, so we can continue the dialogue, Tyler, once
Okay.
Keith responds to your specific items.
I would love to, and I'm happy to have an offline meeting with you guys. But if we're going to get these two trade associations, the development community on board, we need to have some follow-up conversations about this stuff, because otherwise we're going to be mobilizing our efforts to let city council know our thoughts about how this is all going down.
Okay, to go to your next comment about the zoning code required spaces versus the actual provided spaces. And as you noted, we did make this change due to the fact that there's a large portion of projects in the city of Denver that would not have any zoning required spaces. So we did change it to the number of provided spaces for the facility. Now, if we're talking about a large parking lot, say a big Walmart parking lot with a Starbucks that's being built, we're not going to ask you to include the entire parking lot, the entire Walmart parking lot for one Starbucks. It's going to be based upon the number of spaces that you have an agreement with for the Starbucks. So it would be based upon that in that situation. Those are some special cases that we will take into account with that. Otherwise,
and I think, Keith, what we had suggested is, if there is no code requirement, then yeah, go with what's provided. And of course, you guys need the ability to deal with special circumstances. But if there is a code requirement, then we should be going with what the code requirement is. I mean, it's a huge impact. I mean, you've got some retailers that are providing 3 times as much as Denver's code requirement, and Karen can chime in with the number of stalls this would impact on our just one small project, but it's a huge deal.
This is the way we thought it would make it fair across all projects, because if you have just the zoning required for several projects, and then say like going down Broadway, one side of the street has 0 zoning code required, so they have to provide it based upon the total provided spaces, where across the street they only have to base it upon the zoning required spaces. It's not really fair to both sides of the street. So that's the reason that we made the determination to go forward with the actual number of provided spaces.
Yeah, I understand the equity question, and I think it's, I don't know how you solve it, but I can just tell you, boots on the ground, what this means, and it's hundreds of thousands of dollars of charging impacts to projects. It's not inconsequential.
Okay, we do understand the ramifications, Tyler, but I would like Keith to be able to finish his rebuttal so that we can more on a code process and then continue the dialogue.
The next one was the location of the ADA, or the location of the EV chargers. And you had mentioned that it needs to be near the ADA stalls. What we're asking for is that the location is going to be near the entrance to the buildings. And the reason for that is because we want to encourage the use of EV chargers. If the EV spaces are installed, quite a distance away from the building, it's going to discourage the customers and even the building occupants, the employees, from using an EV vehicle if they have to park a half mile away or something. That's the reason that we want to keep them near the building entrance. Now, there is a requirement that the ADA space must have at least an EV ready space in the ADA space. So that is a requirement, but that's a separate requirement, I think, than what you're discussing there.
All right, Keith, is that's the complete response?
And then as far as if you're worried about having multiple ADA spaces along in like a strip mall parking lot that's got ADA space here and ADA space there and ADA space there, there again, we would look at which ADA space is being utilized by the project that's under consideration, and that's where we would require the ADA space to be installed.
All right, is that it, Keith?
Yes.
All right, so there's a couple thoughts that I want to share for clarification purposes. So there are projects where we have multiple ADA locations, and they might be a half a mile apart, or multiple locations of parking spaces, and we certainly don't want one ADA spot in front of a Starbucks to have it, but then an ADA in front of whatever the other retail might be, a shoe store or something else, that it's a half a mile away, and they want to go to the shoe store, but the charging station, that would not be fair to someone with accessibility requirements, accessibility issues. So that's part of the thought process with that. Tyler, with your request on the having the 5-for-1 change, we have no issue with accepting that. And if you want to do that for multiple locations, it would have to be done through an admin mod, though. And here's our thought process. This process that we're going through right now is really errata. It's really just cleaning up where there was mistakes or miscommunication or clarification required on what the intent of the code adoption process was. And this happens. You have a code, and there are unintended consequences that happen, right? A major unintended consequences was that there are a number of spots in the central business district that don't require parking, and then they might be providing a boatload of parking, and we're not getting any EV chargers, which doesn't help forward our goals as a city and county to be at net zero energy by 2035, which is now being pushed potentially in the next public processes to be maybe even 2030. So that's an unintended consequences through language in a code that really it needs to be revised so that we're getting what the intent of that code process was that went through this whole public process to get to where we are. And throughout that process, and I know you weren't involved, but and I was very much a proponent of making sure that this is affordable, that it doesn't have, unintended, huge cost of construction implications, so that we're creating huge hurdles for, affordability in residential projects, or huge hurdles creating unaffordable consequences for developers. And in every conversation that we had, this was part of that dialogue. We always kept that first and foremost through all the decisions that were made in the committee. That balancing with, we have some very aspirational goals in Denver to be net zero by 2035. And in order to get there, we need to be moving towards electrification, especially in our vehicles, because of the amount of impact that has in terms of our negative impacts on the climate within and around Denver. So there's some really hard decisions we had to make, but we're willing to work with you. The reason why we'd have to do that 5-for-1 over 5 would be, that's the way the code language was put and meant to be put into the code. It's hard for us through an errata process to change the code, because that's not really the intent of what we're doing now. And that's why at the beginning, I mentioned at the beginning of this, we are welcome to have anyone involved in our process in the spring for our next code cycle, so that if there are concerns about constructability or affordability, those items can be brought forward again in that code process, so everyone in the public can be part of the dialogue. And because we don't have a big audience now, we're talking about errata now. We've only got, 38, 40 people on this meeting, and that's not fair to be making decisions in a context of 40 people when we had, literally hundreds of people involved in that process when we were going through it. So I do want to be fair, and I want you to know that we will work with you through administrative modification processes. If you have a project between now and the next code cycle, we're glad to work with you.
Tyler, I see you have your hand up again.
Yeah, and Scott, I appreciate the explanation point, and I just don't know how we missed this last code cycle, because the first time this came up was when your planning department was surprised itself by the implementation of these EV requirements back in January. They even had no idea. We have active projects. Kathy Barsner and I track this stuff as tightly as pretty much anybody can, in the city on what's going on with the cities. And I don't know how many actual owners and people who are paying for these chargers, not consultants, not, climatologists, but actual people who are going to pay for these things were involved in your 2019 update or cycle or whatever it was. But the reality is now we are. And the people who are actually paying for all this stuff are at the table. And I do agree, these are not appropriate things to be figuring out during an errata process. And that's the challenge for us. Is I feel like we knew the code updates were going on, but this is not code update stuff. This is major policy issues, deciding how you design parking lots, where thousands of dollars of conduit and wiring are going, and who's paying for what, and access to it, and ADA. I mean, these are huge issues that have material impacts to every single project in the city. And I feel like it's kind of being, at this point, shoved down our throats, for lack of a better word. I know that's not your guys' intent, and I think you guys probably went through a great process last year, but the reality is without some relief on some of these fronts, which I think can easily be done, these are huge changes for active projects in process, and staff still can't give us a clean answer on what we're doing with live SDPs, on what you got to do where and how many and all this stuff. I mean, it's kind of crazy. It's like I would love it if this whole EV charging thing could be pulled out, and so we can have some dialogue.
Yeah, I know, Tyler, that you weren't involved in the process. Unfortunately, I wish you were there. And so it's the big change already happened. That was in the code process. And again, NIAP was made aware of that process. We were not shy about including NIAP in that discussion. And I will say that prior to going to council, we even highlighted this at LUDI so that it was publicly facing that these, because we couldn't go through thousands of code changes, right, at LUDI, but we highlighted the ones that were the most significant and that had an impact, a big impact on the development community. So even before the council vote, if you missed the whole code process, we highlighted it at the LUDI meeting. That was a public meeting that gets a lot more public attention than our code process does. So we try to be very outward facing about the high profile items that were going to impact the development community. So I do believe, and we had another public meeting inviting developers, engineers, architects, all groups of people. We had hundreds of people at that meeting, and we specifically highlighted this at that meeting prior to go to LUDI. So it wasn't like we were shy about, hey, this is a big change, red flags, big change. It was out there. So I'm sorry that your team missed this. It was not our intent to have you miss this. We would have rather had you in the dialogue when we were developing the code, because this isn't code development. This is just code tweaks now, right? Typos and clarifications. The big change happened already. And again, if you have a big project that is underway and it's going to happen before the next code amendment process, we can work with you through the administrative modification process. We certainly don't want to have like a huge negative impact on projects, but we also want to honor the code amendment process that had hundreds of people involved with input and then went through the whole council process for approval. We have to honor that process.
Yeah,
So-
no, I get it. I get it. And I think what we've suggested are a couple of things that can work within this errata process. You know, and I don't know what, you know, why you don't feel like you can go with a code provided standard, or why you feel like you can't do an unlimited 5-for-1 conversion factor, because those two things would help swallow the pill.
Yeah. So
I mean, otherwise
again,
you're going to get a tidal wave of applications for
Tyler-
variances.
Yeah, Tyler, it's between now and next spring. We will gladly, I know it's a $200 fee, but I think that's de minimis and compared to what we're talking about. We are glad to welcome admin mods for that swap. So you have my commitment as the building official. We're going to allow this as long as we have that the criteria in there for the one to, you know, there's at least one in there, and we can do it. The problem is we don't want to be making code changes, substantive code changes during an errata process. It's not fair to the community, the code development community that spends so much time on this.
Yeah, but
So that's
that's
why
fine.
I'm
Yeah,
willing to
I
work
get that.
with you.
I get that on 5-for-1, but why can't we go with what was originally in the language, which was based it on code required, not code provided? I mean, that's a change you guys made after the fact.
Yeah. So it's because I mean, Christy, it seems like you want to speak. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that actually the language was not clear on whether it was based off of the zoning number or the total number of spaces. It did not state that it was based off of the zoning number, and that's a really important distinction. We did not change that. We clarified based on the intent of the committee that worked on this previously.
So Tyler, we internally made a policy because it was simpler, because it was going through the site development team first to say, we'll just use the zoning code because that's the world they're used to using, even though very seldom, if at all, does the building code ever reference the zoning code, right? So,
Yeah.
but we said, okay, for simplicity, just policy wise, this is a policy that we'll put in place. And the unintended consequences that we realized afterwards was that policy negated any parking going into a non-required parking. So we were getting zero EV chargers if zoning parking wasn't required. And there were all these parking spaces going into all these projects and no EV chargers. So that's an unintended consequences based on a policy. And because there wasn't ambiguity in our language in our mind, because we could just say any parking provided based on the wording. We're trying to make it clearer now and get rid of that policy. So that just
the challenge
for clarification.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is we've got SDPs based upon that original policy, and now we're going to have 3 times as many parking chargers. I hope that you guys can think about that too. I understand why there's a challenge with the way the zoning code's written, but it also is a huge change for those of us who've got stuff in mid-swing. So, I mean, can you address that via variance process as well?
Yeah. Do you have specific projects, Tyler? I think,
yeah, I do. We can talk about it later, but I don't need to do that right
now.
Yeah,
I do want to address like some of the specific concerns that you had. I like talking about this in a public forum because I think it's important that everyone gets to hear your position and your side of things. I think it's really important. If you feel we beat this horse enough, I would definitely welcome and recommend yourself and maybe a few other folks, along with Christy and Keith and some of our team, continue this dialogue. And maybe we can see what we can do through admin mods or other processes. If possibly there's some code language that would be considered more technical change that would work for both of us. I'm always open to a win-win solution. I think everyone that knows me, I'm very developer friendly. Most of my career was on the other side of the fence, so I get where you're coming from. So I'm always solution based, trying to get there wherever we can. But I do have to also balance honoring the system and the code adoption process that we went through.
Okay.
So I'm glad to
I'll
meet
put-
with you, though.
Yeah, I'll email you guys and appreciate it, Scott. Thank you very much.
Hey,
Are
Tyler,
there-
one thing I would like to add for projects that are currently, you're currently working through the process, we are allowing projects that are through the first formal review of the SDP phase. If that's by the time we have the first reading with City Council, we're going to allow you to use the zoning code required spaces.
Okay, thank you.
So that
That is
does
very
handle the projects where you've started the process and you've gotten at least through to the SDP phase. So
Okay, thank you.
trying to help you out in that case there. So
Shauna Mazingo dropped something into the chat. Shauna, if you'd like to talk, you can. Otherwise, I can also read what's in the chat.
No, it's fine. I just having helped a lot of jurisdictions adopt codes, I could say that Denver was of the entire United States, the most public process that any jurisdiction has ever gone through. And so, I mean, every day they were posting the code, every proposal that anybody ever proposed was posted online. The agendas for all the meetings were posted online. So it was a very, very public process, and the public had the ability to attend. I don't know how you drove people to your site, but you also have your newsletters and everything. I get emails all the time on what Denver's doing, and so I just feel like Denver just from the other side. If people are left out, that's a bummer. But I mean, I don't know what else Denver could do, because they do honestly way more than just about every other jurisdiction I've ever worked with in my life.
Thank you for that feedback, Shauna. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Shauna. Brad Emmerich, I saw that you had your hand up, but you may have taken it down. Do you have anything else to add?
No, I was just going to point to Shauna. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. If nobody else wants to add any comments or have any questions, I will continue sharing my screen and move on to the next slide.
And I do one last comment that I do want to make is that I do appreciate, Tyler, your group and yourself bringing this to light. Don't think that we view this as a negative to get the feedback, because we can't have this one-sided thing. It has to be an open dialogue where we're working with folks. So I appreciate your input. So don't think it comes on deaf ears or unwelcome, because that's not the case.
Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that.
okay. And Tyler, I appreciate your comments as well. In working with, I know I've been working with Karen and with Erica Vester, where they brought to our attention about the 5-to-1 ratio that was dropped off there, that we tried to get added back in there. So any other comments you have, feel free to give me a call or to give me an email, and we can chat through it and try to come to some resolutions there.
Keith, do me a favor, just for closure on this. If you could set up a formal meeting that I'm involved in with Tyler and whoever else he wants from his team and or other work groups, development groups that want to attend the meeting with our team. If you could take the lead on setting that up, that would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I'll do that. Tyler, if you could email me, my email is keith.fox@denvergov.org. That way I've got your email address, so I can include you in the meeting and anybody else you would like to have attend that meeting as well.
Yeah, no problem. I'll probably include Kathy over at NAOP. But yeah, I'm happy to do it. And thank you, Keith. Appreciate it from everyone.
That Tanner, I believe you had some questions there. If you would like to attend the meeting, if you could do the same thing, I would appreciate that.
I dropped Keith's email in the chat if you guys would like to access it there. All right, so we're going to jump back to the IRC for a minute, because these amendments related specifically to EV chargers as well. So we've got in 1101.6 modified the definition of high efficacy light sources to match IECC definition. In 1101.6, modify definitions for the EV chargers. In 1101.11, in 1101.13, and in 1102.1, modified section to match the IECC. In 1104.2, modified requirements for EV chargers. In IRC appendices, status of appendices on adoption. Changed Appendix T to adopted or to match the IECC code committee recommendation. Does anybody have any questions or comments on these proposed amendments? Okay. And finally, we have our Denver Green Code proposed amendments. We've got section 501.3.8.1, removed incorrect section reference. 701.4.1.1, removed incorrect section reference and renumbered subsections. 701.4.2.9, updated incorrect section reference and removed unclear language. Table C, 403.22, removed incorrect section reference. 801.3.1.1, updated section reference. 801.3.1.6, removed incorrect section reference. 901.5.1.2, removed incorrect table reference. 1001.3.1.1.2.1.1, removed incorrect table reference. And 1001.3.1.1.2.1.2, 1001.3.1.1.2.1.3, and 1001.3.2.1 removed incorrect section references. Any questions or comments on these changes? That is the end of our presentation. If anybody else has any questions or comments, we welcome them at this time. And please remember, if you are dialing in by phone, you need to hit *6 to unmute yourself.
Amanda, I would like to thank you very much for narrating this and getting through some very technical aspects of the presentation. So it was very much appreciated that you handled that component for us. And want to thank everybody again for attending today. And we do appreciate everyone's feedback.
Thank you, Scott. And for anyone that would like to view the full summary of what the proposed changes are, as well as the track changes document with all of the strike throughs and underlines and proposed amendments within it, you can find those documents available at denvergov.org/building code.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great night. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hello?